So welcome back. We're going to launch today really right into the forgiving challenge. And in this series, we'll be looking primarily at how Jesus forgives, and specifically looking through the lens of how Jesus forgives Peter. And so today we're going to encounter the sin that Peter is probably most known for. Here's the thing. If you look at Acts chapter 4, verse 13, we hear this about Peter, that he's unschooled and ordinary. All right? Nothing unique or special about him at all. And perhaps that's why I can relate to him so well, because I don't really feel like there's anything necessarily special or unique about me as well. He was this ordinary, unschooled, nothing special about him guy. We can say that God sees something in him. Whether you're unschooled and ordinary, just like Peter, doesn't matter. God sees something in you. Jesus sees what you can be, regardless of what your history has been. So about 18 months ago, I picked up a book, read this book by Mike Foster. Mike Foster is a pastor and a counselor, and the book is called The 7 Primal Questions. And what this pastor, counselor, Mike Foster, he spent 2 years just investigating and doing a lot of work. And what he discovered is that embedded within each and every one of us is a primal question. And he determined there's 7 total. And we can discover that our primal question has probably been embedded to us from some point all the way back in childhood. And this primal question is what drives our feelings and drives a lot of our behaviors. And so your primal question might be, am I good enough? Or maybe it's, do I have a purpose? Or it could be, am I safe? Or perhaps, am I loved? My primal question, I discovered, is, am I wanted? Am I wanted? And when I think about that question, I can literally trace it all the way back to my childhood when I was about 4 or 5 years old, in some events that took place in my life that really embedded that question into me. Now, I'm not going to go into the story behind all that. If you want to know, man, come sit down. I love to. I'll share my story, and I'll share how that primal question became a part of my life. Am I wanted? But what I can tell you is that ever since then, that question has kind of driven a lot of my behaviors, good or bad, because I want that question to be answered as a yes, I am wanted. And so ever since then, we might say my life has been somewhat of an audition before others, right? Seeking acceptance, wanting to be wanted and included and desired. And so everything that I would do behavior-wise, good or bad, was trying to get that question, am I wanted, answered as a yes. And when it's not answered as a yes, we kind of go into what's called a scramble, and generally our behaviors are pretty poor because we're working really hard to get that question answered yes. But when we understand what our question is, it can actually help us to improve our behaviors, our reactions within the world of acceptance. So while your primal question might be something like, am I safe, or do I have a purpose, something different than mine, the reality is embedded within each of us, because of our sinful nature, is still this desire for acceptance. Maybe it's the desire to be accepted by your parents, or from your siblings, or from the larger part of your family. And I will be very honest, that is a huge one for me in all my life, with this desire for being accepted and seen and recognized by a lot of my family. Maybe for you, the acceptance you're looking for is with a coworker or with your boss, and you think to yourself, when will they notice me? When will they give me the approval that I know I not just desire, but I deserve? When will they offer me that promotion that it should be mine already? And so you're working toward that. That's the approval or the acceptance you're looking for. Maybe it's in social circles. Maybe the acceptance you're looking for is with your peers and social groups, and you think to yourself, if only they would notice me. And so we do all these behaviors in order to try and get noticed, to be included. And if that happened, you think to yourself, everything would change for me. And here's the reality. While approval, acceptance is kind of embedded within us in our sinful nature, we need to be reminded of this very real truth. Before you ever did anything, before you ever breathed a breath, before you ever made a cry, God set his sights on you, and through Jesus has given you a brand new identity as his child. You have been accepted because of what Jesus has done for you. So you have identity, and because of that identity, you have meaning and purpose. And here's the reality: because of that, Jesus sees you, and Jesus sees something in you. Even while inwardly knowing all of the details of your life, intimately knowing you, knowing every single detail of your past, good and especially bad, knowing exactly where you are today in the present, knowing what you will be doing in your future, both good and bad, God still says, I want you. I want you. Which means this: you no longer have to chase after approval of anyone or from anything else in this world, because you have already been accepted and loved by God because of what Jesus has done for you and your identity with him. Something that is a reality that Peter had to learn as well, and we're going to really get into that throughout the whole series. But let's just talk about Peter now for a moment before we kind of get to the big picture. Peter was an all-in kind of guy. We can see that from the very beginning when we meet Peter, right? He's called from being a fisherman to be a fisher of men by Jesus. Jesus said, come and follow me. And Peter, all in, he dropped everything to follow Jesus. Peter was also known, we know him as this bold, outspoken individual. We see this in a very, very clear and good way in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 16. There's this moment there where tensions are pretty high between Jesus and the religious leaders. And Jesus pauses in that tension, and he takes the disciples aside, and he asks them this question that you're probably very familiar with. He says, who do people say that I am? And the disciples kind of start chiming in. Well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah or Jeremiah or maybe one of the prophets. And then he stops aside again and he says, but who do you say that I am? And this is where we see big and bold Peter shine, because it's here that Peter really hits the bullseye when he says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Peter nails it. And Jesus lets Peter know he did nail it, right? He got it, because he said, upon this confession of yours, I will build my church, and the gates of hell cannot overcome it, right? So this is one of those bright moments where big and bold, audacious Peter, but he nails it. He gets it right. In just a few short years, Peter walking with Jesus is not just one of the 12, right? This big, bold Peter becomes part of the inner three with James and John, right? And we can, again, say kind of the right-hand man to Jesus. So this uneducated, ordinary guy, big and bold and all outspoken, right-hand man to Jesus, right? In fact, what we would say is there might not be another person who spent so much intimate time with Jesus than Peter did, which is kind of what ends up being a little bit shocking as we fast forward, right? Fast forward to Maundy, Thursday. It's the eve before Jesus will endure the passion and sacrifice, that sacrificial death on the cross in our stead to save us from our sin. And he's gathered in that upper room with the Last Supper with his disciples. And he informs the disciples, one of you is going to betray me, and another one of you is going to deny me. And here, big, bad, bold, audacious Peter stands up outspoken and boldly declares, right? Even if all these other guys fall away, I will never deny you. What a bold statement. We also can go, how would you feel if you were one of the other disciples in the room, just got thrown under the bus by Peter saying, all these other guys might fall away, but never will I. And it's when Jesus turns to him and says, truly, I tell you, Peter, this very night you are going to disown me 3 times. Peter declared, never, even if I have to go and die with you, Jesus, I will never disown you. Well, fast forward a few hours, right? Jesus has been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's been taken away toward the high priest's house. Peter follows along from behind with a big mob, and he finds himself in the courtyard of the high priest where Jesus is being unjustly tried. Peter gathers around this, you can see a big old fire pit there in the courtyard with a lot of the other mob who are just kind of watching everything that's unfolding. And it's then that this little servant girl notices Peter and says, wait, you were with him, right? And Peter says, I don't know him. And then a short time later, someone else looks at Peter and says, no, you are. You're one of them. And Peter's like, no, I'm not. I have no idea what you're talking about. We're told an hour then passes, and yet another person looks at Peter and says, no, you were with him. And Peter says, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know this guy. And at that moment, the rooster cries. And as soon as that rooster cries or crows, Peter turns and he realizes what he's said. He turns and he looks toward Jesus to only discover Jesus staring right at him. Can you imagine the wealth of emotions in that moment, right? You just fell as hard as you could, because that's exactly what Peter did. He fell and failed horribly, only to turn and look and see Jesus staring right at you. At that moment, Peter gets up. We're told he runs out of the courtyard and he cries. The one that jumped out of the boat to walk on the water with Jesus, the one who cut off a servant's ear trying to defend Jesus, the one who made bold proclamations time and time again. And here Peter is failing, falling, sinning. And there's that word, right? The word sin, which we kind of fall into today as we look at Peter. And it's a bad word, right? That's an ugly word in the world in which we live. The culture of the world in which we live today, that's an offensive word, an incredibly offensive word. One of the most offensive things you can say to someone today in today's day and age out in the world is call them a sinner. Whew, nothing more offensive than that. And yet, here's the truth. I think if everyone in the world truly knew what that word meant, they might not be so offended or shocked by it. So the term sin literally comes from an archery term, meaning to miss the mark, right? To miss the mark. So if you saw a dartboard or an archery, target, you've got that target right there in the center, the bullseye. And if the bullseye is the mark and you miss it by just a fraction of a millimeter, guess what? You missed the mark. You still missed the mark. And that's what sin is. Sin is to miss the mark, right? We live in a world and in a culture that likes to tell us that tell every person that they are good just the way they are. We're told that we're supposed to affirm every single person just the way they are. But here's the problem, right? We all miss the mark. Even when our intentions are good, even if we're doing good, but maybe we just missed the mark just by a little bit because our intentions are good or we've tried the best that we can, and yet, guess what? You missed the mark. We'll never, ever perfectly hit the mark of what God expects and demands of us through his law, right? Why? Because we are all, ready for it, sinners, right? We miss the mark. We're not perfect. We never will be. No matter how much you work on yourself, no matter how much you try to improve in keeping all of God's law, in loving God in the most perfect way, and loving our neighbor as ourself, the very best version of yourself will still miss the mark. It'll never be good enough for God's expectations. And so here's the thing. The last thing we should do for one another is be fake and act like we've got it all together. Act like we're close to hitting the mark, or maybe even act like we did hit the mark, right? I know that's not true for me. I know I miss the mark all the time, and I know that you do as well. Talked about it last week. Each of us have scars. The scars are evidence of how we've missed the mark in our life. And what we would also say is that these scars that we have, often we're hiding them under metaphorical Band-Aids. And so one of the first things that we need to do is to rip that Band-Aid off and let our scars be seen for what they are, a byproduct of the sin in our lives. We do that by admitting that we're sinners, admitting that no matter how hard we try, we still miss the mark. We're not perfect, and because of that, we need God's grace and his forgiveness that comes to us only by way of Jesus. And so we reveal our scars. We confess our sin. We confess that we are sinners in need of God's grace so that we can bring it all before the one who can do something about it, that is Jesus. Here's a phrase that I'd like for you to kind of remember. The admission price into freedom begins with the admission of our sin. I'll say it again. The admission price into freedom begins with an admission of our sin. Because here's the truth. I will never be free if I can't admit my weaknesses, if I can't admit my mistakes, if I can't admit all the times in which I have missed the mark. And so you got to be bold like Peter, but in a different way. We have to be able to acknowledge and say, hi, my name is Gene Johnson. I'm a sinner. I miss the mark every single day, sometimes really bad, sometimes not so bad. But either way, I miss the mark. I'm a sinner. I struggled in the past with lust and guilt and pride and wrongful comparison. I've been known at times to be apathetic, indifferent, harsh, and even unmerciful. And here's the thing, the last thing that I need from you is for you to accept me for who I am today, because I am not okay with who I am right now. I want to be better as a follower of Jesus. I want to give my best to the one who's given his all for me. You know, most of us look at Peter and we wonder, how in the world did he miss the mark so bad in that scene around that campfire? You know, hours earlier, he'd made that big, bold statement, I'll never fall away from you. And here he is falling, right? Missing the mark in a horrific way. But here's the truth. Everything that Jesus did for Peter, he's done for you as well. Jesus didn't just die on the cross to save Peter from his sin and forgive him. Jesus also went to the cross for you. You are the reason Jesus died on that cross, to forgive you as well. Why? Because he loves you. Why? Because he has chosen you, because he sees you. Not because of anything that you have done or will do in the future, but because he loves you. And he sees you. Again, the admission price into freedom begins with the admission of our sin. Every failure, every fall, hear this, every failure and every fall is an opportunity to fall into the grace of Jesus. And that is our takeaway for today. And so let me leave you with this challenge. And the challenge is this: how will you more intentionally let yourself be authentic, be seen, scars and all, knowing that the only approval and acceptance you need is yours already in Jesus? The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you now and always. Amen.
Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out our sermon series on the Forgiving Challenge. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to our channel so you stay up to date on all of our future releases. Have a blessed week, and we'll see you next time.